That night, the rain fell as though the sky itself were weeping for things no one dared to say aloud. Marin Caldwell stopped before the iron gate of an unfamiliar estate, her thin coat soaked through, her chest aching with milk that her child buried just 3 weeks before was no longer here to drink. The pale glow of a street lamp spread across the wet pavement, lighting the worn fabric suitcase she clutched, as if it held all that remained of a life. She drew a trembling breath, wiped away. That night, the rain fell as though the sky itself were weeping for things no one dared to say aloud. Marin Caldwell stopped before the iron gate of an unfamiliar estate, her thin coat soaked through, her chest aching with milk that her child buried just 3 weeks before was no longer here to drink. The pale glow of a street lamp spread across the wet pavement, lighting the worn fabric suitcase she clutched, as if it held all that remained of a life. She drew a trembling breath, wiped away the salt mixed with rain, and had almost turned to leave. But then a child's cry drifted out from behind the lit windows, thin, broken, like the call of a small soul lost inside a house too large for it. And right after came a man's voice, hoarse and exhausted, nearly shattering with despair. "I'm begging you. Please stop crying. I don't know what to do anymore, Eli." Marin's feet felt rooted to the ground. It was not only the ache in her chest, but something deeper stirring within her, the place where an unfinished past met a fragile longing to begin again. She looked up at the estate looming behind the iron fence, its tall windows, and a figure pacing back and forth with a baby behind the curtains. She wondered who this man could be, with a voice so commanding, yet so easily broken by the cry of a child. Her hand trembled before it touched the bell. Once, softly, then harder. The gate swung open, but not by the one she expected. 2 broad-shouldered men with cold, flat faces stepped in front of her, their eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, as if she were a threat, and not a woman caught in the rain. Then, from behind them, a low voice rose, sharp as steel yet cracked with weariness. "Let her in." And when the man stepped into the light, eyes red from sleepless nights, jaw unshaven, his expensive shirt rumpled, a wailing 10-month-old baby in his arms, Marin understood that she had knocked on the very door no one in this city dared approach. The most powerful man of the underworld stared at her, as if weighing whether she was a miracle or a disaster. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice still hard, but his eyes long since broken. "And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so that together, we never miss another story that heals the soul." Marin hadn't had time to answer the man's question before the baby in his arms suddenly broke into a fiercer cry, tearing through the heavy silence that had just stretched between them. It was no longer the frail sob she had heard from behind the door moments earlier, but the wail of a life far too small, struggling against something it couldn't name, an emptiness that even its father's arms couldn't fill. Eli's tiny body arched backward, his 2 hands clenching and then opening in the air, his face flushed red and soaked with tears, as though he were calling for someone he had never seen, yet his body still remembered. The man held the child tightly against his chest, awkwardly rocking him, soothing him with a large hand accustomed to very different things. But the more he tried to comfort him, the louder the crying rose, like water spilling over a cracked dam. Something in Marin's chest tightened, a reflex older than reason, older than fear. The milk in her body ached in answer to that cry, as though her body and that child were speaking to each other in a language neither of the men in the room could hear. Before she could think, she stepped forward, her hands already lifting slightly, and she heard her own voice come out, soft but certain. "Please let me hold him for a little while." At once, one of the 2 broad-shouldered men blocked her path, his arm hard as an iron bar, his cold eyes sweeping over her with suspicion. "No one touches the boss's son," he said, his voice low and flat as stone. Marin didn't step back. She lifted her eyes and looked straight at the man holding the child, ignoring the wall of flesh standing between them, and said in the gentle voice that years of suffering had worn into a strange kind of strength, "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I only know this cry. I used to hear it every night. Please let me try." The man stood there, his eyes bloodshot from so many sleepless nights, and stared at her for a long time. In that sharp, cold gaze, she could read a struggle, the guardedness of a man who had spent his whole life trusting no one, fighting against the exhaustion of a father who had hit the bottom. Then he gave a slight jerk of his head toward the bodyguard, a gesture so small but enough for the whole room to understand. Let her try. The iron-like arm lowered, though the man's face still couldn't hide his disapproval. Marin stepped closer, held out both hands, and the man hesitated for a moment, before placing his child into the arms of a rain-soaked stranger. The instant Eli touched her chest, she closed her arms around him in an embrace her body had never forgotten, leaning slightly, pressing the baby's cheek into the hollow between her shoulder and neck, and began to sway very slowly, very steadily, to an ancient rhythm, like the lullaby rhythm of every mother in the world. She didn't sing words, only hummed deep in her throat, a warm sound almost like a breath with melody, letting the vibration in her chest pass into the tiny body trembling from its tears. And then the strange thing happened. Eli's wail caught halfway, turned into a hiccup, then another hiccup, farther apart, softer, like the rain outside slowly easing. His tiny hands stopped clenching, and his little fingers found the wet edge of her clothes and held on. His broken breathing gradually steadied. His swollen eyelids drooped. In less than 1 minute, the child who had cried through so many nights in that vast house lay still in her arms, his face pressed into the warmth of a stranger, breathing the deep, peaceful breaths of real sleep. Silence crashed down over the room so suddenly that everyone froze. The two bodyguards looked at each other, unable to believe what they had just seen. And the most powerful man in the underworld, the man whose slightest frown was enough to make others tremble, stood motionless in the middle of the magnificent living room, his hands hanging empty and useless at his sides, watching the soaked woman lull his child to sleep. On that harsh face, for the first time in a very long while, his defenses dissolved, giving way to something he had buried so deeply that he had almost forgotten its name. He looked at her no longer as though he were looking at a danger or a stranger, but as though he were looking at something he didn't dare believe was real. The man looked for a long while at the child sleeping peacefully in a stranger's arms, then turned to the nearest bodyguard and lowered his voice, though every word remained sharp and clear. "Prepare the room at the end of the downstairs hall for her. 1 night only." Marin heard the words "one night" and understood at once what they meant. This wasn't an invitation, not kindness, but a concession with an expiration. A door opened just wide enough before it would close again. She wasn't offended, because in the world she had just stepped into, trust was clearly a luxury no one gave away for free. He came closer, carefully taking the baby from her arms, and no matter how gentle the movement was, his eyes didn't leave her face for even a second, as though he were trying to read what was hidden behind that tired, gentle look, as though a woman who could soothe his son to sleep in only a moment must surely be hiding some secret. "Who are you?" he asked again, more softly this time, and she only answered that she was someone looking for work, that she had heard this house needed help, and that she had nowhere else to go tonight. He didn't press further, only gave a faint nod, then handed her over to the bodyguard with an order she heard very clearly, even though it was spoken in a low voice. "Watch her, don't let her wander." The bodyguard led her down the hallway, and that was when Marin truly saw the house she had just entered. The ceilings were soaring, the glittering crystal chandeliers poured cold light over the polished marble floor, and each of her footsteps rang out before dissolving into a vast silence. Expensive paintings hung on the walls in gilded frames, but there wasn't a single family photograph, not one crooked child's drawing, not a trace of meals shared with laughter. Every piece of furniture was luxurious and flawless, polished until there wasn't a speck of dust. Yet that very perfection made the place feel more like a museum than a home, a place meant for display rather than living. She passed a large sitting room with a stone fireplace, but the hearth was ice cold, with not a single log inside, as though no one had bothered to light a fire there for a very long time. The air in the house carried a strange chill, not the chill of the weather, but a coldness that had soaked into the walls, into the floors, into every lifeless object, the cold of a place that had everything except human warmth. Marin suddenly thought that a child growing up within these walls, surrounded by this mute wealth, crying every night was hardly surprising, because even the adults here seemed to have forgotten what it felt like to be held. The room given to her was at the end of a long hallway, smaller and far plainer than the rest of the mansion, with only a bed, a cabinet, and a window looking out over the dark yard. The bodyguard set her worn cloth suitcase on the floor, glanced around the room once, as though making sure there was nothing she could use, then withdrew, and she heard the scrape of a chair being dragged into place right outside her door, followed by the heavy sound of someone sitting down. They were guarding her even when she was so exhausted that she no longer had the strength to do anything except lie down. Marin sat on the edge of the bed, took off her soaked shoes, her feet numb with cold, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe out long and deeply. She didn't blame them for their suspicion, because she understood that in this life, people only guarded what they were afraid to lose, and a man who had to build an entire wall of bodies around his child must have lost so much that he no longer dared to believe in anything. She lay down in the unfamiliar room, listening to the last of the rain tapping softly against the glass. And in her mind, the man's face kept appearing as he watched her lull his child to sleep, that moment when the ice across his face had cracked open and revealed something that looked very much like loneliness. And she wondered whether tomorrow, when daylight came and this one night was over, they would keep her there or push her back out into the rain. Lying in the unfamiliar room with the steady breathing of the guard outside the door, Marin closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Only the past rushed back like water breaking through a dam, because the baby's cry earlier had stirred up everything she thought she had buried deep. Only 1 year ago, her life had still carried the shape of a home, however small and difficult it was. She had once had a husband named Daniel, a gentle man with hands calloused from construction work, a man who kissed her forehead every morning before leaving for work and promised that when their child was born, he would build the baby a room of its own, with a window that caught the sunlight. He was the kind of man who believed that as long as you worked hard and stayed decent, life would one day be decent in return. And she had believed him. She had let that faith lull her through the months when her belly grew larger along with her hope. Then, one autumn afternoon, while she was sitting and mending a tiny shirt for the baby, people knocked on her door with lowered faces and halting words. A scaffold at the construction site had collapsed, and her Daniel was among those who would never come home again. She hadn't been able to cry at that moment. She had only stood there with the baby shirt still in her hand, feeling the whole world tilt beneath her feet, while the child inside her kicked once, as if it too had heard the terrible news. People told her she had to be strong for the little one, and she tried. She forced herself through the final months of pregnancy in absolute loneliness, telling herself that the child about to be born would be the part of Daniel she was still allowed to keep. The baby came into the world on a winter night, a tiny little boy, red and fragile, letting out one weak cry before burrowing against his mother's chest in search of warmth. And in that moment, Marin thought perhaps heaven still had mercy on her, that it had still left her one reason to live. But that comfort was more fragile than she had imagined, because only a few weeks later, the baby began to wheeze, his skin burning with fever, and every breath he took sounded like painful scraping. She carried him to the clinic, but they said his condition had grown serious, that he needed to be transferred to a larger hospital, that he needed costly treatment, and she didn't have that money. She had no insurance, no one to borrow from, only 2 empty hands and a heart breaking apart. She had knelt down and begged. She had gathered every last coin. She had even sold her wedding ring, but all of it was too little and too late. Her child left her on a gray morning, small and quiet, leaving behind in her an emptiness no words could ever fill. And then came the cruelest thing, the thing that reminded her with every passing day that she had once been a mother. Her body kept making milk for a child who was no longer there. Her breasts ached with fullness each morning when she woke, like a mockery from her own flesh. You were born to feed, to hold, to nurture. So who are you supposed to nurse now? She couldn't bear the silence of the house that had once held laughter and promises. She couldn't bear the pitying eyes of the people who knew her. That kind of pity that turned her grief into something on display. So she packed a few sets of clothes into her old cloth suitcase, locked the door of the house that no longer held anything worth keeping, and left in search of a place where no one knew her name, a place where she could do any kind of work. Wash dishes, scrub floors, clean rooms, as long as she could live quietly among strangers who wouldn't ask about her past. And so she went from one place to another until her feet carried her to the iron gate of this house in the rain-soaked night. And now, lying there as the rain slowly faded outside the window, Marin opened her eyes in the darkness, her hand unconsciously resting on her chest, and she understood that the way the baby named Eli had stopped crying in her arms earlier wasn't a miracle. It was only 2 lonelinesses accidentally finding each other in the night. While Marin sank into a fitful sleep in the room at the end of the hallway, upstairs in the mansion, inside a spacious study lined with dark wooden bookshelves and a long polished desk, Rourke Sullivan still hadn't gone to bed, even though his son had finally fallen asleep because of the strange woman. He stood by the window, a glass of liquor in his hand that had barely touched his lips, looking down at the city glittering with lights spread out beneath him, the city most people only saw by its dazzling surface, while he knew every dark vein running underneath. At 34, Rourke was already a man. Even the most powerful spoke to in cautious tones. A man whose single phone call was enough to change the fate of many others overnight. He hadn't become that man by luck, but by a lesson driven into him since childhood. A lesson his father had carved into him as if carving into stone. That affection was the crack where enemies slipped in the knife. That in this world, softness only made a person pay in blood. He had lived by those words for many years, cold, calculating, never allowing emotion to lead him, until a woman named Claire entered his life and melted part of that ice. The gentle wife who had once made this house feel, for a time, as warm as a real home. But then she left after a severe illness, leaving him with their tiny son and an emptiness that all the power in the world couldn't buy back. And from then on, the old ice sealed over thicker than ever, so thick that he thought he had forgotten how to feel. That night, his rare quiet was cut short by a knock at the door, and a man named Briggs, someone Rourke had trusted to oversee part of the business, stepped in with a face trying hard to remain calm, though his hands were trembling slightly. Rourke didn't turn around at once. He let the silence stretch long enough for the other man to feel its weight by himself, then slowly spoke. "I hear this month's books are missing a sum, Briggs. Would you like to tell me where that number went?" The man stammered a denial, offering every kind of excuse, saying there must have been some mistake somewhere. But Rourke only set his glass down on the desk, a very soft click that sounded through the room like an ill omen. Then he turned and looked straight into the man's eyes. He didn't raise his voice, didn't strike the desk, didn't make a single unnecessary movement. He only looked, but that gaze was so cold and sharp that the large man's face went pale, sweat beading across his forehead, though the room wasn't hot at all. "I gave you the chance to tell the truth," Rourke said, each word falling evenly and coldly, like drops of freezing water, "and you chose to lie in this very room, in front of me. That disappoints me even more than the money you took." The man collapsed to his knees and begged for mercy, promised he would pay it back double, triple, pleaded with Rourke to remember all the years he had followed him, and Rourke let him finish, patient as a wolf standing still while its prey wore itself out. Then he said only one sentence. "You have 2 days." And the way he said the words, 2 days, made the man understand that this was the final line, that the mercy of this man had a bottom, and he had just touched it. When Briggs left the room on unsteady legs, Rourke turned back toward the window, his face showing not the slightest ripple of emotion, because to him, this was only something that had to be done. One of the countless things that had made him a man the entire underworld feared and respected. But tonight, strangely, as he looked at his faint reflection in the glass, he didn't see the familiar image of a cold-hearted boss. Instead, he saw for a fleeting moment the rain-soaked woman bending over to lull his son. And for the first time in a very long while, a vague question slipped into the mind that had only ever been used to calculation: why a stranger could reach something that even he, the child's father, couldn't reach. Morning came to the mansion in a pale wash of sunlight through the tall windows, and the first thing Rourke realized when he opened his eyes was the silence, a silence so complete and unfamiliar that in the first moment he bolted upright in alarm, because for weeks now, every morning of his had begun with the sound of his son crying from the next room, a cry that had become a painfully familiar part of the rhythm of his life. He walked quickly to the baby's room, his heart tightening with worry, then stopped short at the threshold, before a sight that made his chest catch in a very different way. Eli was sleeping deeply in his crib, his tiny hands loosely curled and resting on either side of his head. His plump cheeks flushed pink, rising and falling with each steady, peaceful breath. His little face relaxed and serene as though he had never known what crying was. His son, for the first time since the day his mother died, had slept through an entire night. Rourke stood there for a long time, not daring to breathe too hard for fear of shattering that moment, and he realized that his hand, the same hand that last night had made a large man tremble and turn pale with nothing more than a look, was now trembling slightly as it reached out to touch the edge of his son's crib, awkward and weightless, as though he feared he was too rough for something so fragile. That was the strange contrast of his life. The same man who could give orders of life and death and make an entire underworld bow its head and obey. Yet when night came, he fumbled helplessly, not knowing how to warm a bottle to the right temperature, not knowing how to wrap a diaper so it wouldn't press uncomfortably against his child. A man who could control everything except the crying of his own son. He went downstairs and found Marin already awake early, standing close to the hallway, like a guest who didn't dare step beyond the part of the house she had been allowed to occupy. Her brown hair still a little tousled from a short sleep, but her eyes already alert and quiet. He looked at her for a moment, then said, his voice still carrying its familiar hardness, "Though with less of last night's ice, the boy slept well all night. That hasn't happened once since he lost his mother." Marin only gave a faint nod, showing no triumph, asking for nothing, and that very calmness made him pay even closer attention. He made the offer plainly, without circling around it, saying that he wanted her to stay and care for the baby, that he would pay her a salary she would be hard-pressed to earn anywhere else, enough for her not to worry about food or shelter for many years. For someone with no home, no place to go, and not a dollar to her name, this should have been a dream offer. And yet Marin hesitated, and that hesitation showed clearly on her face. She knew who the man standing before her was, or at least she had already sensed the cold and dangerous world surrounding him, the atmosphere that made large men lower their heads, and part of her feared that stepping into this house meant stepping into a place where she couldn't foresee anything. But there was another part of her, the part that had awakened last night when the baby stopped crying in her arms, the part belonging to the milk and the motherly instinct she had never had the chance to use, that kept holding her in place and wouldn't let her refuse at once. "I need time to think," she said softly, and Roark, who was used to people eagerly nodding at everything he offered them, found something in that honest hesitation that didn't irritate him at all, but instead made him feel a strange kind of trust, because in his world, the faster people accepted money, the faster they usually betrayed you, while this woman seemed to weigh even kindness carefully, as though she were afraid of receiving more than she could ever give back. In the end, Marin decided to stay, and within only a few short days, the house that had once been as cold as a silent museum began to change in small ways no one could immediately name, only feel. On her first real morning of work, she stepped into the vast kitchen, with its gleaming, expensive appliances that seemed never to have truly been used for their proper purpose, and she set about cooking a simple pot of oatmeal porridge for the baby, along with a fragrant pot of coffee for the household. Then, for the first time in a very long while, the warm smell of food drifted out from the kitchen, spread down the long hallways, slipped into every corner of every room, and awakened something very much like the feeling of a home where people actually lived. She pulled the heavy curtains that had always been kept closed to either side, and the morning sunlight rushed in, flooding the space, laying warm golden streaks across the cold marble floor, making tiny specks of dust dance in the beam of light as though the whole room had just let out a breath after too long a sleep. But the greatest miracle didn't come from the smell of food or the sunlight. It came from the baby. Eli, who had always been fussy and frightened of strangers, clung to Marin from the very first days as though his young heart had recognized in her something familiar that it had been longing for. She carried him out to the sunlit backyard, set him down on the grass, and for the first time in that house, there rang out a sound the stone walls had never heard before. The clear, bubbling laughter of a child. Marin played peekaboo with him, covering her face with both hands and then opening them again, and each time she did it, Eli laughed so hard that he tipped backward, his shining eyes narrowing with delight, his two little hands clapping together in pure excitement. She picked up a yellow leaf and held it up for him to see, letting him grasp it, letting him discover the world with his tiny, curious hands, and she told him wandering little stories with no beginning and no end, in a gentle voice he couldn't understand, yet still listened to with complete attention, as though he were drinking in every sound. The household staff, who had long been used to moving quietly and speaking softly for fear of disturbing the mansion's heavy stillness, now sometimes stopped at the thresholds and smiled when they heard the baby's laughter, as though they too had just been reminded that this place, after all, could still be a home, and not merely a fortress. In caring for Eli, Marin found something she had thought she had lost forever: the feeling of being needed, the feeling that her hands were useful, that there was a place to put all the tenderness that had been dammed up inside her. Every time the baby tucked his head against her shoulder in search of sleep, every time his tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers and held tight, something in her chest was both aching and warm, aching because it reminded her of the child she had lost, warm because it showed her that her heart still had the full ability to love, even after it had been shattered. She didn't try to fill the old emptiness with this baby. She understood that those two little lives could never replace each other, but she also didn't refuse the affection that was naturally growing between her and Eli, because perhaps this was exactly the way life had arranged for two abandoned hearts to find each other and heal together. And so, day by day, the house that had once been frozen slowly gained the smell of fresh baked bread. More streaks of sunlight invited inside, more small, unsteady footsteps, and bright bursts of laughter, as though a shy spring were quietly knocking at the door of a place that had been trapped in winter for far too long. Even though the house had gradually begun to grow warmer, Rourke still hadn't fully let go of his suspicion, because in the world he lived in, kindness was often only a beautiful mask, hiding a calculation, and he had seen too many people smile gently before drawing a knife. So he decided to test this woman in the only way he trusted. One afternoon, he had Marin called up to his study, and when she stepped in with a little flower still clinging to her apron, he pushed a thick envelope toward her across the polished wooden desk. Inside was a large amount of money, more than the salary he had promised, large enough for someone like her to start her whole life over anywhere she wanted. And he said in a flat, probing voice, "This money is for you. You can take it and leave here today if you want. I won't stop you. You're free." It was a trap laid with great care, because Rourke wanted to see what this woman had truly come here for, whether for his child or for the things his wealth could give, and he had already prepared himself to watch her seize that money like so many others had, so he could tell himself he had been right, that in this world there was no such thing as affection given freely. But Marin only looked at the envelope for a moment, then lifted her eyes to him, and what she did next caught him completely unprepared. She gently pushed the envelope back toward him and said in a soft but firm voice, "I'm not staying here because of this money, and if you think you can measure my heart with it, then you're mistaken." She paused for a moment, then went on, "The thing that makes it hard for me to leave isn't this grand house or your money. It's the boy. It's the way he searches for warmth in my arms every night. It's the way his eyes light up every morning when he sees me. A child who needs to be loved can't be paid for with money. And I happen to have too much love inside me with nowhere to give it." Rourke sat in silence, the coffee cup in his hand forgotten before he could drink from it, because this was something he had never encountered in his entire life. Someone with the chance to hold a life-changing sum of money in her hands and still refuse it, not out of false pride, not as a way to bargain for more, but because of a feeling so real that he almost couldn't recognize what it was. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty had a price. Silence had a price. Even life itself had a price, and he had grown so used to that truth that he believed it was an unchanging law of human nature. Yet the slender woman standing before him, the woman who had nothing in her hands except an old suitcase and a heart that had once been broken, had just refused the very thing most people were willing to betray one another to possess. He remembered what his father had once taught him, that affection was the crack, where an enemy slipped in the knife, and for the first time in his life, he wondered whether his father had truly been right, or whether the old man had lived and died inside a cold delusion that he had passed down to him, like a poisoned inheritance. Something inside Rourke's chest, something that had been frozen since the day Claire left, stirred faintly. It didn't melt all at once. It only cracked open along one small line, just enough for a thin ray of light to slip through. And for the first time, he looked at this woman not as an employee to be guarded against, not as a possible danger, but as a human being whose kindness left him both unsettled and longing to believe. He picked up the envelope, put it away in the drawer, and said softly, almost to himself, "You're the first person in this house who has ever refused my money." And Marin only gave him a faint smile, not fully understanding the weight of that sentence, not knowing that she had just stepped through a door no one before her had ever been allowed to enter. The trust just beginning to take root between them was still too fragile to withstand the blow of the truth. And that blow came late one night, when Marin woke to the sound of Eli stirring softly, and went down to the kitchen to warm a little milk for him. On her way back upstairs, as she passed the hallway leading to Roark's study, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar, light still spilling from inside, along with the low murmur of men's voices. She should have walked straight past as she always did, but something in the tone of that conversation made her feet stop. She heard Roark's voice, still the same cold, deep voice she knew, but the things he was saying made the blood in her body seem to freeze. He was speaking about territories, about men who had dared to move into his ground, about making a certain group of people understand what the price was for standing against him, and the other men in the room answered him with the absolute obedience of those who knew only how to follow orders. They mentioned names, debts, threats, spoken with a calm so chilling it raised the hair on her skin, as though they were discussing the weather instead of deciding the fate of human lives, and Marin stood rooted in the dark hallway, her hands gripping the still warm bottle of milk, hearing her own heart hammer inside her chest. She had sensed from the very first night that danger surrounded this man. She had seen the cold-faced bodyguards. She had seen the way the whole house seemed to hold its breath whenever he frowned. But a vague feeling was one thing, while hearing clear proof with her own ears that the man she was living under the same roof with, the man whose child she was caring for, was truly a boss of the underworld, was something else entirely. She quietly withdrew to her room, set the bottle down with hands trembling so badly she nearly spilled it, and all through that night she couldn't close her eyes, her mind spinning with every kind of fearful thought. She thought about what could happen to someone who accidentally knew too much. She thought about the world of hatred and violence she had unknowingly stepped into. She thought she had been far too naive to let pity for a child lead her into such a dangerous place. She blamed herself, because a woman who had already lost everything should have known how to be afraid, should have known how to protect herself, and yet she had let her soft heart pull her into the house of a man whose mere presence beside her could bring disaster down upon her. Near dawn, when the sky outside the window began to turn from black to a pale gray, Marin had made her decision. She would leave. She would pack her old suitcase and quietly walk away from this place before she was pulled any deeper into a world that wasn't meant for people like her. She sat up, dragged the suitcase out from under the bed, and began placing her few clothes inside it with hands that were still shaking, trying not to make a sound, trying to convince herself that this was the right thing to do, that her safety mattered more than any young tenderness that had only just begun to grow. But when she closed the suitcase and lifted her head, her eyes accidentally fell on Eli's door at the far end of the hallway, where the baby was sleeping soundly, and the hand gripping the suitcase handle suddenly loosened, because she realized that leaving wasn't nearly as simple as she had thought, that between the fear urging her to run and the invisible thread holding her back, she would have to choose, and that choice was heavier than anything she had ever imagined. Marin remained frozen on the edge of the bed. Looking down at the closed suitcase, she realized that running away wouldn't erase the invisible threads holding her back. Her reason and her heart waged one final battle inside her. Reason told her to go, to run as far away as she could from that dangerous man and the shadowed world he lived in, to think of herself for once after all she had lost. But something else, deeper and more enduring than fear, kept quietly speaking up against every argument reason made. She thought of Roark, and strangely, the image that appeared in her mind wasn't the cold boss speaking of hatred in the night, but the clumsy father carrying his child back and forth in desperation, the man standing silently as he watched his son sleep peacefully for the first time after so many nights, with an emotion he tried to hide, the man who had pushed a large sum of money toward her, and then gone still when she refused it, as though he had never believed there could still be something in this world that couldn't be bought. She had lived long enough, had suffered deeply enough, to learn one thing, that people rarely turned cruel because of their nature, but often because they had been wounded, and then built walls around themselves so they would never have to hurt again. And she realized that behind Roark's frightening shell of ice was a vast loneliness, a solitude even deeper than her own, because at least she still knew how to cry for what she had lost, while he seemed to have forgotten how to soften it all. Then she thought of Eli, the baby who had chosen her in the most instinctive and purest way, the baby who woke each morning and searched for her first with his eyes, the baby who held onto her finger as he slept, as though as long as she was there, the whole world was safe. And she wondered that if she left in the night, like someone running away, then tomorrow morning, when that little boy woke and didn't see her, the fragile young heart that had just learned how to trust would break again, and she would become one more person who had left him behind. Marin knew too well what it felt like to be left. She knew too well the pain of having someone you love disappear from your life, and she couldn't, simply couldn't, bring herself to cause that pain with her own hands to a tiny soul who had already lost his mother. She lowered her eyes to her calloused hands, the hands that had once held a child she hadn't been able to keep, and she understood that perhaps life had brought her to this house not so she could run away one more time, but so she could stay and do the thing her heart had always longed to do, to love, to protect, to turn a cold place into a home. And so, in that quiet moment at dawn, Marin made a choice, not because she was trapped, not because she had nowhere else to go, but as the clear and conscious choice of a woman who had weighed both her fear and her conscience. She bent down and pulled the suitcase out from under the bed again, but this time it was to open it, to take out the clothes she had hurriedly packed and place them back into the wardrobe, one piece at a time, slowly and firmly, as though every movement was a promise to herself. She would stay, not to close her eyes to Rourke's dark world, but to be one small point of light inside it, to care for a child who needed her, and perhaps, who knew, to remind a man who had forgotten he was once human that his heart wasn't entirely dead. When she put the last item away and closed the wardrobe door, Maren breathed out a long, relieved breath, and for the first time since the day she lost everything, she felt that she was no longer a leaf being blown aimlessly by the wind, but a person who had chosen where to stand, and it was that choice that made her feel stronger than ever. That night, after choosing to stay, Maren woke to the sound of Eli stirring softly in his crib, and she quietly rose, stepping into the baby's room beneath the dim glow of a small nightlight that cast a gentle golden haze like thinned honey. She bent down and lifted the little boy into her arms, pressing him against her chest in an embrace that had become instinct, then began to softly sing an old lullaby, a song she herself couldn't remember where she had learned, only that it had always lived inside her as though it were part of her flesh and blood. A low, tender melody flowing from her throat like warm water. But tonight, as those lullaby words rose in the still room, they carried something heavier than they had on any night before, because every line brushed softly against the old wound in her heart, waking the memory of another child, another warmth her arms had once held, and then lost forever. She rocked Eli as she sang, and her tears simply began to fall in silence. Not loud sobs, but the quiet tears of a sorrow hidden for too long, falling without sound and soaking into the thin blanket wrapped around the baby. She sang for Eli, but she also sang for the child she no longer had the chance to lull to sleep, sang for all the words of love that had been trapped in her chest through months with nowhere to go. And in that moment, the boundary between the two children in her heart seemed to blur, letting her, for once, fulfill the motherhood fate had stolen from her hands. She had no idea that outside the doorway, Rourke had been standing there for some time. He too had been unable to sleep, and had passed by, intending only to glance in at his son before returning to his room. But the sight before him pinned his feet to the darkness of the hallway, and he stood still, holding his breath, witnessing something he had never seen in all the cold years of his life. He saw that woman holding his child and crying, not because she was tired, not because life had been hard on her, but with tears so deep that even he, a man long hardened against every human expression, could feel their weight pressing down on the entire room. And then he understood, a sudden understanding that came over him so sharply, his chest tightened, that this woman could soothe his son not because of any skill or secret, but because of her own pain, that the warmth that had calmed Eli on the very first night was the warmth of a mother who had once lost her child, a love too full with no one left to receive it, now finding a tiny soul to pour itself into. Standing in the darkness, the most powerful man in the underworld, a man who had never shed a single tear even in the face of his own losses, suddenly felt his eyes burn, and he had to lift a hand to cover his mouth so no sound would escape, because he realized that the two people in this house, he and she, both carried the same wound. They were both people who had loved and lost, both holding inside them an emptiness that nothing in the world could fill. The only difference was that while he had buried his pain beneath ice and calculation, turning it into cruelty so he would never have to be weak again, the slender woman before him had done the opposite. She had allowed her pain to soften into compassion, turning loss into the ability to love even children who weren't her own. By the time Maren sang the final line, Eli was fast asleep, and she bent down to place a light kiss on his forehead, whispering something too softly to hear, then gently laid him back in the crib. When she turned to leave, Rourke had already quietly withdrawn into the darkness, returning to his own room with a strange feeling rising in his chest. And that night, for the first time in many years, the man who had seemed turned to stone lay in the dark and let two streams of tears run down his face, crying for her, crying for his son, and crying for himself, while a fragile warmth was quietly growing inside Rourke's house, across the city, in another building that was also luxurious but carried a more vulgar and brutal kind of glitter. A man sat looking down at the wide map spread across his table with the eyes of a predator measuring territory. Garrett Vance was a name the underworld spoke with a mixture of caution and disgust, because if Rourke was a cold wolf with laws of his own, Garrett was a beast that knew no limits, a man who had climbed up from the very bottom by trampling anyone who stood in his way, and now his ambition had grown so vast that the city itself had become too small for him. He had been watching Rourke's empire for a long time, watching the fertile territories, the profitable businesses, the authority that made the entire underworld bow in respect and fear, and inside him churned a hunger nothing could put out. He wanted all of it for himself. He wanted to become the man standing at the summit Rourke now occupied. What embittered Garrett most wasn't Rourke's wealth, but the way people respected him, the way even the coldest men spoke of Rourke, in a voice both fearful and admiring, as though he were a living law, while Garrett, though more brutal and reckless, only made people terrified and was never truly respected. He had been silently preparing for this struggle for many months, quietly buying off the dissatisfied, planting his people in weak links, probing every move and habit of his opponent, patient as a coiled snake waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, he summoned his most trusted men, and in a hoarse, self-satisfied voice, he said it was time for Rourke Sullivan to understand that his reign was nearing its end, that this city couldn't go on kneeling forever before a man who thought himself a king. One subordinate timidly reminded him that Rourke wasn't an easy opponent, that he had a vast network and loyal men ready to die for him, but Garrett only sneered, a cold and venomous smile, then said there was no fortress without a crack, no man without a weakness, and their job was to find that weakness and drive the blade deep into it until the entire castle collapsed. He ordered his people to begin a meticulous investigation into every part of Rourke's life, leaving no corner untouched, from his business dealings to his private habits, from those closest to him to the secrets hidden behind the gates of his mansion, because Garrett believed that the more unbeatable a man appeared, the more carefully he was hiding something that, once touched, would bring him down completely. He didn't yet know who the woman named Marin was. He didn't know about the child. He didn't know about the warmth just beginning to bloom inside that house, because to Garrett at that moment, this was purely a war for power, a game he was determined to win at any cost to satisfy his bottomless greed. But the investigation order he gave that night, that cold command meant to uncover his opponent's fatal weakness, was the very thread that would slowly tighten until it reached the most precious thing Rourke had only just found again in his life. And the darkness Garrett cast over the city that night, though no one inside that warming house yet knew it, had already begun to slither quietly toward them. A few days later, news of an injustice reached Rourke, not through the usual business channels, but through the trembling account of an older woman who worked in a market district under his protection, and that story awakened the coldest part of him in a way that only one thing in the world ever could. People said Garrett Vance's network had crept into that area, and his men had begun strangling poor vendors with outrageous protection fees, threatening families who had only the thinnest little savings, forcing the vulnerable to hand over their last coin under cruel threats. An old man who sold goods had his entire stall smashed because he couldn't pay enough. A widow raising a small child had been driven to the point of selling the pushcart she depended on for a living, and those powerless people had no one to ask for help, no door to knock on, except for the rumor that the man who ruled this territory had one strange rule the whole underworld knew, because Rourke Sullivan, no matter how ruthless he was toward equals who dared betray or challenge him, had one unshakable principle he had kept from the beginning. He never tolerated the strong bullying, the weak, never allowed other wolves to tear apart the sheep within his domain, and it was that unwritten law that made the ordinary people under his reach, though they knew who he was, quietly see him as a crooked but real shield. That night, Rourke went in person to the place where Garrett's men were gathering, not bringing a noisy army with him, only a few trusted men, because he understood that true power didn't lie in numbers, but in the presence that made others tremble. When he stepped inside, the room that had been loud a moment before fell suddenly silent, and the men who had just been swaggering while bullying the poor went pale when they realized who stood before them. The leader of the group, a large man used to overwhelming others by size and force, tried to appear tough, but his voice was already shaking when he asked what Rourke wanted. Rourke didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to strike first. He only walked forward slowly, his gaze sweeping across each face like an invisible blade, then said in the cold, deep voice that had made so many men kneel that the people they had just harassed were under his protection, and that setting foot on his ground to exploit the weak was a mistake they would pay for. The leader tried to resist, tried to signal his men, but in an instant, Rourke's people had taken control of the situation cleanly and decisively, and the confrontation ended far faster than those aggressive thugs had imagined, because the arrogance of men who specialize in bullying the weak always collapses pitifully when it meets real strength. Rourke stood looking at the leader, who now had no toughness left, and told him to go back and tell Garrett Vance that this city had lines that must never be crossed, that anyone who dared touch the innocent people under Roark's protection again would not get a second chance. And every word he spoke carried the weight of a warning no one would dare take lightly. When it was over, he had his men quietly compensate the vendors who had suffered losses, restore the old man's stall, help the widow redeem her pushcart, and he did all of it silently, without show, as though it were merely a matter of putting his own house back in order. But on the way back to the mansion that night, sitting in the car and watching the city lights slide past, Roark realized something that made even him fall into thought. That for a very long time, he had punished evil only as a cold habit meant to preserve power. But tonight, when he thought of the vulnerable people who had been oppressed, something strangely warm had risen inside him, and he dimly understood that the woman in his house, with her quiet compassion, had begun to change even the way he looked at the things he himself did. Roark's move in the market district, though carried out cleanly, unintentionally hastened the very thing Garrett would otherwise have had to work harder to find, because when the subdued men dragged themselves back to Garrett Vance and reported their humiliating failure, his anger didn't explode into shouting, but settled into a coldness far more frightening. He sat motionless for a long time, his finger tapping evenly on the tabletop. And instead of rushing into blind retaliation, he ordered the investigation into Roark's private life to be tightened even further, because now he was even more certain that a man willing to personally appear on behalf of a few poor, lowly street vendors must be hiding some softness inside him, and that softness was the fatal weakness Garrett needed to find. Garrett's men began spreading their net around Roark's mansion, patiently watching from the shadows, recording every person who entered and left, every habit, every schedule, and before long, an unusual detail entered their sight, the presence of a strange woman in a house long known as a sealed and cold fortress. They noticed that this powerful man, a man who had never exposed even the smallest opening of feeling, had begun showing small, strange changes since this woman arrived. The lights in the house were brighter. He came home earlier than usual, and sometimes, through the window, they caught a glimpse of him standing still and watching the yard, where the woman was playing with a child. When that information was placed on Garrett's desk, along with several photographs taken from a distance, he picked them up and studied them as a smile slowly spread across his lips, the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of blood, because he understood at once that he had found what he was looking for. Not a business connection or a traitor, but a human being, a woman whose presence had cracked the layer of ice that had seemed impossible to pierce in his opponent. He looked carefully at the woman's face in the photograph, and then something flickered through his memory, a vague feeling that the face wasn't entirely unfamiliar, as though it stirred some old thing from the tangled web of debts and miserable lives he had once been involved with. But he hadn't yet managed to follow that thread of memory, only marked the feeling of familiarity as something that might become useful later. What delighted Garrett now was a cold truth he had always believed in, that the greater the power, the higher the cost of tenderness, that a man who loved nothing had nothing to lose, and was therefore almost impossible to defeat, but once his heart had found a place to rest, that very place became the door through which an enemy could enter and pull everything down. He realized that to bring Roark Sullivan down, he didn't need to confront his powerful network directly, didn't need to spill blood in an evenly matched war, but only needed to touch that newly grown soft place, only needed to threaten the thing that cold man had just learned to cherish, and his proud fortress would begin to shake from within. And so, sitting in the darkness with the woman's photograph in his hand, Garrett began drawing up a vicious plan, a plan that didn't aim at Roark's strength, but straight at his heart, at the very human part of him that had just come back to life after so many frozen years, without knowing that the woman he was targeting also carried a past that might unexpectedly connect to his own old crimes. Garrett chose to make his move on an afternoon when Marin went out alone, because she had a habit of going to the small market by herself a couple of times each week to choose the freshest things to bring home and cook for the household. And this time, as soon as she left the safe area around the mansion, his men were already waiting. Fortunately, the baby Eli wasn't with her that day. The little boy was at home, happily playing under the care of a trusted nanny and the familiar household staff, completely unaware of the storm closing in, still safe within his own laughter and familiar games, far from every danger. As for Marin, when she realized strange figures were closing in around her on the empty street, she understood what was happening. But there was no longer any way to escape, and within moments, she was put into a car and taken away, her heart pounding wildly, not out of fear for herself, but from a gnawing worry for the child at home and for the man who would have to face this. They brought her to an old warehouse at the edge of the city, a deserted and freezing place, and there, for the first time, she came face to face with Garrett Vance in the flesh, a man with a smile that sent cold down a person's spine, and eyes that looked at her as though she were a chess piece that had just been placed exactly where it belonged. He didn't need to lay a hand on her, because his threat was carried entirely in the cruel, unhurried tone of his voice, as he told her that she was only a card he would use to force Rourke to his knees, that her fate now depended entirely on how much his enemy thought she was worth. Maren stood straight in that cold warehouse, and though fear trembled inside her, she didn't let herself collapse. She looked him directly in the eyes and said she was only an employee, only a caregiver for the child, that he had misjudged things if he thought she had any real value to a man that powerful. But even as she spoke those words, she herself wasn't sure whether she was telling the truth or trying to protect both Rourke and the baby by making her own role seem small. Garrett only laughed. He walked slowly around her and said he didn't believe it, because people didn't change a whole man for the sake of some ordinary hired woman. And as he spoke, his gaze once again lingered on her face, with the look of someone trying to remember something, the vague sense of familiarity he had felt when he first looked at her photograph, though even now he still couldn't name it. Suddenly, a cruel light dawned on him. "Caldwell," he murmured, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Your husband was Daniel, wasn't he? The stubborn worker who threatened to expose my illegal construction site before his fatal accident." End quote. Maren's breath hitched as the ghost of her tragic past collided with the monster standing right in front of. Here, he had his men lock her inside a small, dark room in the warehouse, then left her there with loneliness and uncertainty, an imprisonment that didn't need lashes or blows, because darkness, isolation, and bone-deep cold were already enough to wear down a person's spirit. Sitting curled in the corner of that dark room, Maren wrapped her arms around her knees, and what hurt her most wasn't her own dangerous situation, but the image of baby Eli at home. She wondered whether he had started looking for her by now, whether when night fell and he didn't find her beside him, that young heart would break again from being abandoned one more time, and that longing for the child made her ache even more sharply than her fear of Garrett. She also thought of Rourke, and a feeling of fear and regret rose together inside her, because she understood that her presence in his life had accidentally become the opening his enemy could exploit, exactly like the cold philosophy he had been taught, that affection was the crack where enemies slipped in the knife, and she feared that the tender feeling just beginning between them had now become the very weapon turned against the man she was slowly coming to cherish. In that cold darkness, Maren gently closed her eyes, and for the first time after so many months of trying to appear strong, she prayed silently, not for herself alone, but for the baby to stay safe, and for that man to remain clear-headed enough not to lose everything because of her. When Maren didn't return at dusk as she usually did, a vague unease began to creep into Rourke's heart, and by the time night had fully fallen with still no word from her, that instinct turned into an ice-cold fear unlike anything he had known since the day he lost Claire. He sent his men out to search everywhere, and before long, a call to his private number confirmed the worst. On the other end of the line was Garrett Vance's slow, triumphant voice, lazily informing him that his woman was now in Garrett's hands, and that if Rourke still wanted to see her safe, he would have to obediently follow his conditions. In the moment Rourke heard those words, something inside his chest shattered, not the familiar fury of a boss being challenged, but the naked panic of a man about to lose something precious, and he gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles went white, forcing his voice not to tremble. In his entire life, Rourke Sullivan had never begged anyone for anything, because begging was the sign of the weak, the kind of surrender his father had taught him to despise. He had always been the one setting conditions, not the one receiving them, always the man holding the upper hand in every negotiation. Yet tonight, for the sake of a slender woman who had stepped into his life only a short time ago, he did the very thing he had believed he would never do. He lowered his voice, and in a tone even he didn't recognize as his own, he told Garrett that he could have whatever he wanted: money, territory, business interests. Everything Rourke had, he could take it, as long as he released her and didn't harm her. The other end of the line fell silent for a moment, then broke into a pleased laugh, because Garrett knew he had just heard the thing he had worked so hard to obtain, the sound of an alpha wolf lowering his head, the moment an untouchable man willingly exposed his fatal weakness. and he deliberately stretched out the silence to savor that feeling of power, to make Roark taste the full bitterness of helplessness. Roark stood in the middle of the vast study that had once been the symbol of his authority, surrounded by the things that proved the wealth and power he had spent his whole life paying for, and yet he had never felt them more meaningless, because all of them together still couldn't buy the safety of the woman he feared for. And for the first time, he understood the helplessness borne by the vulnerable people he had once protected. He thought of Marin, of her unconditional kindness, of the night he had stood in the dark watching her cry while lulling his son to sleep, and a gnawing regret surged through him, because he understood that it was the dark world he had chosen, the very power he had once taken pride in, that had brought danger down on that decent woman. My father was wrong, he thought in that choking moment. Affection wasn't the crack that made him weak. It was the way he had lived his whole life, denying affection, that had turned him into a man so lonely he had almost failed to recognize what was truly worth anything. He accepted every one of Garrett's conditions without bargaining over a single word, not because he had no other choice, but because to him, in that moment, no empire, no power on earth, was worth trading for Marin's life. And that decision to let everything go, though made in pain and helplessness, was the very moment he truly became a whole human being. But even as he bowed his head before his enemy, deep in Roark's exhausted eyes, a cold flame still flickered, because he knew very well that Garrett was the kind of man who never kept his word, and while his mouth accepted surrender, the mind that had once helped him rule an entire underworld had already begun silently calculating the final move. Roark understood that if he simply brought money to ransom her according to Garrett's demands, Garrett would never truly release Marin, because a man like Garrett, once he had seized an opponent's fatal weakness, would keep tightening his grip and never let go, would use her as a rope to bind Roark for the rest of his life. And so he decided to choose another path, a harder but more final path, one he had never imagined taking in his entire life. In the tense hours before the exchange, he did something that stunned even his most loyal men. He secretly contacted an honest prosecutor in the city, a man who had long wanted to dismantle the underworld but had always lacked the evidence to reach those at the top, and Roark offered him a deal. He would hand over everything he knew about Garrett's criminal network in exchange for the safety of the woman and his child, accepting that the price of this choice was that he himself would also have to step into the light and face his own past. It was a decision that carried a terrible cost, because it meant Roark was taking apart with his own hands the empire he and his father had built over so many years, willingly giving up the power, the wealth, and the untouchable position that had once meant everything to him. But now, standing on the line where he had to choose between his empire and the people he loved, he no longer had even the slightest hesitation. The exchange took place in the very old warehouse where Marin was being held, and Garrett arrived with the triumphant air of a man certain he had already won, believing Roark had come to surrender and hand everything over. But he had no idea that every move he made that night was already in the sights of law enforcement, who were silently spreading their net all around him. When Garrett had his men bring Marin out, still lazily dragging out the humiliation with arrogant words, Roark only looked at her, his eyes softening the moment he saw that she was still safe. Then he said one sentence to Garrett, a sentence whose full meaning Garrett didn't understand in time, that a man who thinks he holds another person's weakness in his hands sometimes fails to realize that his own greed is the greatest fatal weakness of all. Just as Garrett was still frowning over those words, the signal was given, and law enforcement rushed in from every side, closing the circle, turning the trap Garrett thought he had set into the net that came down over him. In the chaos of that instant, Garrett fought wildly to break free, trying to use Marin as a shield to escape, but Roark had already anticipated that last desperate move. He lunged forward and placed himself between Garrett and her. A brief and fierce struggle broke out, but this time the board had completely turned. The predator had become the prey, and in only moments, Garrett was fully subdued, every escape route sealed off, the career he had built on the blood and tears of others collapsing on the very night he thought he was about to ascend to the throne. When everything was over, Roark turned to Marin, who was standing there looking at him with tears shining in her eyes, and he stepped forward and held her tightly in that cold warehouse now flooded with light, unable to speak, only pressing her against his chest, as though he needed to make sure she was truly still here, still safe, still the person for whom he had traded an entire empire. Marin pressed her face against his chest and broke down crying, no longer from fear, but from relief, from the overwhelming emotion of what this man had just done for her, and she whispered, asking whether he knew what he had just given up. Rourke only held her a little tighter and answered that he hadn't given up anything at all. He had only found the one thing worth keeping. The price Rourke had to pay wasn't small, and it wouldn't be easy, because the road ahead of him would bring hearings, testimony, supervision, and a long process of atoning for old wrongs. He would have to live an entirely different life, with no power, no untouchable status, perhaps starting over almost from zero. But as he looked into the eyes of the woman in his arms and thought of the child waiting at home, he knew this was the worthiest exchange he had ever made in his life, because for the first time in so many years, he was a free man, free from his father's shadow, free from the ice he had locked himself inside, and free, at last, to live as a human being who knew how to love. When Rourke and Marin returned to the mansion in the earliest hours of the following morning, the house was still wrapped in the gentle stillness of dawn, and the first thing both of them did, without needing to tell each other, was walk quickly toward the room where baby Eli was sleeping. The nanny, who had stayed awake all night to watch over the little boy, told them he was still safe, that he had eaten well and slept soundly, only turning now and then as though searching for something familiar. And when Marin gently pushed the door open and stepped inside, the baby was sitting in his crib, freshly awake, his sleepy eyes blinking in the morning light. The moment Eli saw her, his small face lit up with a joy he couldn't hide, his tiny arms immediately reaching toward her with longing. And then, looking straight into her tearful eyes, the little boy formed a word he had been trying to shape for months, clear and bright in the quiet room. "Mama." Marin froze at the threshold, her whole body turning to stone for 1 second, because that sound, that name she had believed she would never hear again in her life, that name fate had stolen from her along with the tiny child of long ago, was now ringing out again, meant for her, from a little soul that had chosen her with all the purity of his heart. Tears poured from her eyes, impossible to hold back, but this time they weren't the silent tears of hidden grief. They were the overflowing tears of a happiness so great her chest couldn't contain it. And she rushed forward, lifted the little boy into her arms, and held him tightly, pressing her tear-soaked face into his soft hair that smelled of milk, laughing and crying at once, repeating again and again that Mama was here. Mama was here now. Mama wasn't going anywhere anymore. Standing just behind her in the doorway, Rourke witnessed it all, and the man once known as the coldest figure in the underworld, the man who had spent his whole life never letting anyone see him shed a tear, now stood there with tears streaming down his hard, weary face, and he made no attempt to wipe them away, because the sight before him was so beautiful that it melted even the last frozen place at the bottom of his heart. He looked at the woman holding his son and crying in happiness, looked at the child who clung to her as if she were his mother by blood, and he understood that in this simple moment, 3 people who had once been broken and lost in their own ways had truly found one another and healed one another, that the home money and power had never been able to create had quietly been built by love. Marin lifted her head, her eyes meeting Roark's, and she held one hand out toward him like an invitation. And that man stepped forward, wrapping his large arms around both mother and child, gathering them against his chest in an embrace that was awkward but warm, the 3 of them holding tightly to one another in the room, flooded with morning sunlight. No one saying another word, because every word had become unnecessary before the feeling pouring between them. Eli, nestled between the arms of the 2 adults, giggled softly, his little hands patting his father's cheek and then his mother's, innocently enjoying the warmth surrounding him from every side, knowing nothing of the storm that had just swept through his life, knowing only that the 2 people he loved most were both here now, holding him at the same time. In that embrace, Marin felt that all her old wounds, the loss of her husband and child, the long lonely nights with milk no baby would drink, the months of wandering with nowhere to belong, had finally found meaning, as though all those losses had led her to the very place where she belonged. And Roark, the man who had traded an entire empire just to stand exactly here, inside this embrace, felt for the first time in his life the full meaning of the word family, the thing his cold childhood and his powerful life had never allowed him to taste. And he silently promised himself that no matter what price he had to pay for the past, he would spend the rest of his life protecting this warmth, this true home he had finally found. The path Rourke chose after that fateful night was not smooth, because redeeming a life that had once been dipped too deeply in darkness was never easy. He kept his word, cooperating fully with the authorities, enduring long months of facing his own past in hearings, testifying to everything he knew in order to help tear out by the roots the criminal network Garrett had led. The price he had to pay was most of his fortune, the powerful status that had once made the whole city wary of him, and a stretch of time lived under strict supervision. But every evening, when he returned to the house that was now far smaller and far simpler than before, greeted by Eli's laughter as the boy ran toward him, and by Marin's gentle eyes beside a hot meal, he knew he was richer than he had ever been on any day in that cold former life. The love between him and Marin did not blaze up in haste, but grew slowly through the years, through shared dinners, through nights spent soothing their child together, through quiet moments sitting side by side without needing to say anything, a mature love cultivated from the understanding between two people who had both carried deep wounds. And one day, when he asked her to become a permanent part of that small family, she nodded through tears. Not tears of suffering, but tears of a simple happiness she had believed she would never touch again. Eli grew up in the arms of both father and mother, a healthy child overflowing with laughter, never lacking love, and each time they watched him running freely beneath the sunlight, both Roark and Marin silently understood that it was love that had saved them all, that had turned 3 broken lives into one whole home. Their story leaves us with something simple yet profound, that no one is born entirely bad, and no soul is so frozen that it can't be warmed by kindness, that sometimes one person who dares to love without condition is enough to relight the flame in a heart that seemed to have gone dark long ago. A person's dignity doesn't lie in the power or wealth they hold, but in the ability to open their heart, to feel compassion, to place the life and happiness of the one they love above all other fleeting things. And sometimes, the most beautiful things take root from the very wreckage and loss that life seemed to use to push us all the way down to the bottom. If this story has touched some place in your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel.